The man with the cane touched Dean's hand and whispered, "Was that you on the radio that night?" The cameras were rolling. 200 people sat silent in the studio, and Dean's face shifted like someone had just slapped him across the mouth. Wait. Because what Dean said in the next 70 seconds on live television would crack open a 25-year-old secret and nearly destroy his career. And the producers in the booth had no idea what to do with the footage. Dean Martin had done live television 100 times. He'd handled hecklers, forgotten lyrics, broken props, and once, even a small fire in the curtains. He'd smiled through all of it. But standing on that stage in early February 1970, with the hot white lights washing over his tuxedo and the NBC cameras tracking every flicker of his face, he couldn't find the smile. The man holding his hand was maybe 70, thin as a rail, leaning hard on a wooden cane that looked older than both of them. His left leg dragged when he walked. The rest of the veterans' chorus stood behind him in a loose semicircle, 15 men in dark suits and ties, all of them staring at Dean like they'd just watched him step out of a dream. The show had been going fine up until then. Dean had sung 3 numbers, traded jokes with the announcer, and brought the chorus on stage for a tribute segment. It was supposed to be simple. They'd rehearse a medley, Dean would shake a few hands, the audience would applaud, and they'd cut to commercial, clean, professional. The kind of thing Dean could do in his sleep. But when the chorus walked out and lined up under the lights, the man with the cane didn't stop at his mark. He kept walking, right up to Dean, until they were close enough to count each other's breaths. And then he'd ask the question. Dean's fingers tightened on the microphone. He could hear the faint hum of the cameras, the shuffle of feet in the audience, the low rustle of the chorus adjusting their positions. Nobody moved. The producer in the booth, a sharp kid named Marty, who wore thick glasses and sweated through every taping, leaned forward and pressed his headset tighter against his ear, like that would help him understand what was happening on the stage below. The floor manager stood frozen with his cue cards, hanging limp at his sides. Look, this wasn't a complicated setup. The veterans' chorus had been Dean's idea. He'd wanted to do something for the men who'd come back from the war, the ones who didn't get ticker tape parades or keys to the city, just regular guys who'd done their time and come home to regular lives. The network liked it because it was good optics, and the sponsors liked it because veterans sold soap and cars. Everybody won. But nobody had planned for this. Nobody had planned for the man with the cane to recognize Dean Martin's voice from a radio transmission 25 years ago in the mountains of Italy. Dean looked down at the man's hand on his. The knuckles were swollen, the skin pale and papery. The man's eyes were wet. "It was you," the man said again, quieter this time, almost like he was asking permission to believe it. "I never forgot that voice." Dean opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat felt dry. The lights were too bright. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was telling him to laugh it off, make a joke, pivot to the next song. That's what he always did. That's what the audience expected. Dean Martin didn't freeze. Dean Martin didn't crack. But this wasn't about the audience. This was about the man with the cane, and the night in 1945 when Dean had done something he'd sworn he'd never talk about. Notice something here. This wasn't just fear of embarrassment or bad press. This was deeper. Dean had built his entire career on being the guy who didn't take anything too seriously, who floated through life with a drink in one hand and a joke on his lips. He'd made a fortune playing the charming drunk, the lovable goof, the man who never let you see him sweat. But that night in Italy, he hadn't been Dean Martin the entertainer. He'd been Dino Crocetti, a scared kid with a radio and a choice that could have gotten him killed. and he'd spent 25 years making sure nobody ever connected those two people. The floor manager waved frantically at Dean, tapping his watch. 30 seconds to commercial. Dean could see Marty in the booth leaning over the soundboard, probably wondering if he should cut the feed. The audience was starting to murmur. Someone coughed. A woman in the third row leaned over and whispered something to her husband. Dean's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the man with the cane. Really looked at him. The guy's face was familiar now, that Dean let himself see it. Thinner, older, scarred along the left side of his jaw, but the same. The same kid who'd been bleeding out in a ditch 30 miles south of Florence, while German patrols swept the hills and Dean crouched in a farmhouse attic with a field radio he wasn't supposed to have. Stop for a second and picture the room from above, because what you're about to see only makes sense when you understand what Dean was risking. It wasn't just his reputation. It was the carefully constructed wall between his past and his present, the line he'd drawn between the man he'd been and the man he'd become. And standing there with 200 people watching and millions more at home, he had maybe 15 seconds to decide which side of that line he was going to live on. Dean took a breath. The microphone felt heavy in his hand. He could end this right now. Laugh, deflect, move on. The man with the cane would understand. Veterans understood secrets. But when Dean looked into the man's eyes, he saw something that stopped him cold. Not anger, not accusation, just hope. The hope that maybe after all these years, someone would finally confirm that the voice on the radio had been real, that the promise had been real, that he hadn't imagined the whole thing while he was half dead and shaking in the mud. The floor manager made a slashing motion across his throat. 10 seconds. Dean's mind raced. He thought about his manager, who'd told him 1,000 times to keep his private life private. He thought about the contracts, the sponsors, the carefully managed image. He thought about his kids, who knew their father as the fun dad, the one who sang and joked and never let the weight of the world touch him. He thought about the magazine covers, the album sales, the Vegas shows where he could make 10,000 people laugh without breaking a sweat. Then he thought about the kid in the ditch, the voice crackling through static, the desperate whisper asking if anyone was listening. And he thought about the promise he'd made that night. Not to save the kid, because he couldn't, but to stay with him, to make sure he wasn't alone. Dean lifted the microphone. His hand was shaking, just barely, but the cameras caught it. The audience saw it. The veterans in the chorus saw it. "Yeah," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd meant it to. "That was me." The studio went dead silent. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. The man with the cane closed his eyes and nodded, and a single tear slid down his cheek. The rest of the chorus stared at Dean like he'd just admitted to something impossible. One of them, a stocky man with silver hair and a Purple Heart pin on his lapel, took a step forward, then stopped, like he wasn't sure if he should interrupt. "Wait. Because before we go on, you need to understand what Dean had just done. He hadn't just confirmed a memory. He'd opened a door he'd kept locked for 25 years. And once you open a door like that on live television, you can't close it again." Marty's voice crackled in the floor manager's earpiece, frantic and loud enough that Dean could hear it from the stage. "What is he doing? What is this? Do we cut? Do we stay on him?" The floor manager didn't answer. He just stood there with his mouth half open, watching Dean like everyone else. The assistant director, a woman named Carol, who'd worked in television for 15 years and thought she'd seen everything, leaned against the wall in the wings, with her clipboard pressed against her chest, her eyes wide. Dean cleared his throat. The microphone squealed for half a second, then settled. His name was Eddie, Dean said, nodding at the man with the cane. At least, that's what he told me. I don't know if that was real or not. Everything was fake back then. Fake names, fake papers, fake everything. But Eddie was real. And the night I'm talking about, he was dying. The audience leaned forward as one. You could see it, the collective shift. 200 people suddenly locked in. A teenager in the back row who'd been fidgeting with his program stopped moving. An older woman in the front dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd pulled from her purse. Dean had their attention now, but he didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Eddie, like they were the only two people in the room. It was April 1945, Dean said. I was in Italy, not as Dean Martin. I wasn't Dean Martin yet. I was just Dino, a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, trying not to get shot. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be stateside, doing morale shows, singing for the troops. But somebody screwed up the paperwork, and I ended up attached to a unit moving through the mountains south of Florence. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have training. What I had was a decent singing voice and a field radio I'd swiped from a supply tent because I was bored and stupid. Someone in the audience gasped. Dean ignored it. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was a confession. His voice dropped lower, and the microphone picked up every crack and tremor in it. The sound guy in the booth adjusted the levels, trying to keep it clean, but you could hear the rawness coming through. There was a farmhouse, Dean continued. We were using it as a forward position. I was up in the attic because it was the only place I could get a clear signal. I was trying to tune into Allied broadcasts, maybe catch some music, anything to make the night go faster. It was cold up there, cold enough that I could see my breath, and the only light I had was a flashlight wrapped in a sock so the glow wouldn't show through the windows. And then I heard Eddie. Eddie nodded, his hand still on Dean's. His lips moved, forming silent words. Dean saw it and squeezed the man's hand tighter. He was on a German frequency, Dean said. I don't know how he got access to it. I don't know if he stole a radio or if he was part of some operation I didn't have clearance to know about. But he was out there in the dark, bleeding, and he was calling for help. And the only person who answered was me. Dean paused. The studio was so quiet, you could hear the buzz of the overhead lights, the faint whir of the camera motors, the soft creak of someone shifting in their seat. Marty had given up trying to cut to commercial. The cameras stayed on Dean's face, tight and unblinking. The control booth had gone silent. Even the technicians had stopped moving. He told me he'd been shot, Dean said. Twice. Once in the leg, once in the side. He'd been left behind when his unit pulled back. The Germans were close, maybe 100 yards away. He could hear them talking. He was trying not to make noise, but he was losing blood fast. And he knew if he passed out, that was it. So he called out on the radio, hoping somebody friendly was listening. Dean's voice dropped lower. The microphone picked it up, fed it through the speakers, filled the studio with the weight of it. I asked him where he was. He didn't know. It was dark, and he'd been crawling for maybe an hour before he stopped. He described what he could see: a stone wall, a burned-out barn, some kind of marker post, but none of it meant anything to me. I didn't have a map. I didn't have coordinates. I had a stolen radio and a voice in my ear begging me not to leave him alone. Listen. This is where the story stops being about heroism and starts being about helplessness. Because Dean couldn't save Eddie. He couldn't call for a medic. He couldn't organize a rescue. All he could do was stay on the line and hope that was enough. I told him to stay quiet, Dean said. I told him I'd get help. But I couldn't. There was no help to get. Our unit was pinned down. We had German patrols on 3 sides and orders not to move until dawn. If I'd told my CO about Eddie, he would have said the same thing I was thinking. One guy wasn't worth compromising the position. We'd lose 10 men trying to save 1. That's just math. That's war. Eddie's shoulders shook. Dean tightened his grip on the man's hand, and for a moment it looked like Dean might break too. Like the weight of 25 years was finally too much, but he kept going. But I couldn't let him die alone, Dean said. So I stayed on the radio with him. All night. I talked to him. I told him about Steubenville. I told him about my family, about the songs I used to sing in my father's barber shop. I sang to him too. Quiet, so the Germans wouldn't hear, but loud enough that Eddie could. And he talked back. He told me about his girl back home, about the farm he wanted to buy, about the life he was going to live if he made it through. And every time he started to fade, I'd bring him back. I'd say his name, and he'd answer. The woman in the front row was crying now, openly, and she wasn't the only one. The teenager in the back had his hand over his mouth. One of the veterans in the chorus had his head bowed, shoulders shaking. Dean saw all of it, but he didn't stop. Around 4 in the morning, Eddie stopped talking. Dean said, I thought I'd lost him. I kept calling his name over and over, but there was nothing. Just static. And then maybe 5 minutes later, I heard voices. German voices. They'd found him. The audience held its breath. Dean's jaw clenched. You could see the muscles working under his skin, the effort it was taking to get the words out. I heard them talking, Dean said. I didn't speak German, but I understood enough. They were deciding what to do with him. And then Eddie came back on the radio. He whispered one thing to me. He said, tell them I was here. And then the line went dead. Dean stopped. He lowered the microphone and looked down at his shoes. The cameras stayed on him. Nobody moved. The silence stretched out. 5 seconds. 10. 15. It felt like the whole world had stopped. Eddie was crying openly now, his whole body trembling, and Dean pulled him into a hug right there on the stage. The chorus watched in silence. The audience watched in silence. Marty watched from the booth with his hand over his mouth. Carol, the assistant director, had tears streaming down her face. Remember this. Dean Martin never broke character. Not in public, not on camera. But he was breaking now, and everyone could see it. The man who'd spent his entire career hiding behind a smile and a joke was standing on national television with his arms around a stranger, and the mask was gone. When Dean pulled back, Eddie was smiling through the tears. They didn't kill me, Eddie said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. His voice was rough, choked with emotion, but steady. They patched me up, took me prisoner. I spent 8 months in a camp, but I lived. And I lived because you kept me awake. You kept me from giving up. I never knew your name. I never saw your face, but I knew your voice. And when I heard you on the radio years later singing, I thought I was going crazy. I thought I'd imagined it. But it was you. Dean nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. Eddie reached up and put a hand on Dean's shoulder. And for a moment, they just stood there. 2 old men who'd been young together in the worst night of their lives. The floor manager finally moved, giving the signal to cut to commercial, but Marty waved him off. The show ran long. Nobody cared. Dean and Eddie stood there for another minute, just holding each other's hands, and the cameras captured every second of it. The chorus started to applaud, slow at first, then building, and the audience joined in, and soon the whole studio was on its feet. When they finally cut, the studio erupted. People rushed the stage. The audience stood and applauded, and the chorus surrounded Eddie, shaking his hand and clapping his shoulder. Dean stepped back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to pull himself together. His tuxedo felt too tight. His face felt hot. He could hear people talking, congratulating him, asking questions, but it all sounded far away, like he was underwater. Marty came down from the booth, his face pale, his hands shaking. "You just gave me a heart attack," Marty said, but he was smiling, a wide, genuine smile that made him look 10 years younger. "You know that, right? I thought we were dead. I thought the sponsors were going to kill us." Dean laughed, shaky and raw. "Yeah, sorry." "Don't be," Marty said. He grabbed Dean's arm, squeezed it. "That was the realest thing I've ever seen on television. That was... Jesus, Dean, that was something." Dean didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded and walked off stage, past the crew and the cameras and the lights. Carol tried to stop him, to ask if he was okay, but he waved her off. He found a quiet corner backstage, a little alcove behind some storage crates, and sat down on a wooden box. His hands were still trembling. He'd done it. He'd told the truth, and he had no idea what would happen next. The answer came faster than he expected. The network switchboard lit up within minutes. Calls poured in from across the country. Veterans who'd heard the broadcast, families who wanted to thank Dean, reporters who wanted the full story. By the time Dean made it back to his dressing room, there were 3 messages waiting from his manager, each one more frantic than the last. The next morning, every major newspaper ran the story on the front page. Dean Martin, the smooth crooner, the guy who never let you see him sweat, had cracked open on live TV and shown the world something real. Some people loved it. The mail Dean received over the next few weeks was overwhelming. Letters from veterans, from wives and mothers and children, all of them saying, "Thank you." All of them saying they understood. Some people didn't. His manager was furious, worried about how the sponsors would react, about whether Dean's carefully crafted image could survive this kind of exposure. The sponsors were nervous, but they didn't pull out. The ratings had been through the roof. And Eddie became a minor celebrity overnight. He did interviews, told his side of the story, appeared on talk shows and news programs. Everywhere he went, he carried a photo of himself and Dean from that night in the studio, the 2 of them with their arms around each other, both of them crying. Dean never regretted it. Not once. He'd spent 25 years hiding that part of himself, keeping the wall between Dino and Dean as high as he could build it. But the truth was, the wall had never been as solid as he'd thought. And when Eddie walked onto that stage and asked him the question, Dean realized he'd been carrying the weight of that secret for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Years later, when people asked Dean about that night, he'd just shrug and say it was one of those things that happen when you stop trying to control the story. Eddie passed away in 1983, and Dean went to the funeral. He didn't sing. He didn't make a speech. He just stood in the back and listened. And when it was over, he walked up to the casket and whispered, "I told them you were here." If you want to hear what really happened the night Dean stopped a show because he saw his own past walk through the door, tell me in the comments.